Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Cell number 1 is empty by Marco C. I've seen a lot of things in my career, things that would make a citizen doubt my sanity. From being dispatched to chase a UFO to responding to calls of ghosts. But the most unusual thing that happened to me was witnessed by several officers and a dispatcher. One evening, I had brought in a guy for domestic violence, and as he was a bit rowdy, I was joined in booking by the sergeant and another patrolman. I was in the process of booking Mr. Tough Guy when I glanced into cell number 1. There was a guy in there, short haircut, glasses, and a white t-shirt, just staring at us. I ignored him because I didn't want him to start banging on the window demanding a phone call or anything like that. So I finished the booking process and escorted Mr. Tough Guy to his cell, walking past cell number 1. The guy in the cell just stood there, never saying a word or moving. We all then left booking to go about our business, and sometime later the sergeant asked me to check the paperwork for the prisoners to see if any were ready to transport to the county jail. I grabbed the paperwork and got into booking to do a head count. Cell number 1 was empty. I panicked and told the sergeant, who also panicked, and he and I began to make phone calls to the detectives to see if they had moved the guy or had released him. They all said that they hadn't gone into booking at all. I then checked the computer and paperwork again, and the head count was accurate. No one had been placed in cell number 1. We went to the dispatch office to check the surveillance video for booking. We rewound the footage to where I could be seen booking my prisoner. Then we fast forward to the point in the video where we all walked out. As soon as we walked past the door, the guy in number 1 blinked out of existence. We were all freaked out by the occurrence, believe you me. When we tried to transfer the video to DVD in a USB drive, the guy in the cell didn't appear. We still hear and see stuff every now and then, and prisoners in the detox tank can be seen talking to someone in the direction of cell number 1, even though it appears to be empty. To this day, I'm wary of going into booking alone. A Different Kind of Evil by Meredith S. Several years ago, I took a 911 call for a family reporting their teenage daughter was possessed. They claimed no possibility of drugs or a history of mental health issues, which of course I didn't believe for a second. Family members were holding her down, and I could hear 2 people screaming at each other in the background. I asked the caller to tell whoever was yelling at her to stop, and the caller said, "It's her." I responded that I knew it was her, but whoever was yelling at her at the same time to stop. The caller again said, "It's her." Both voices. I kid you not, it was the creepiest thing I have ever heard. I've been doing this for 25 years and I've heard many things. I know of man's inhumanity and the horrible things people do to each other, but this was a different kind of evil. I was clearly hearing a young girl screaming at the same time an adult male was yelling back. I couldn't understand either language, but there were clearly 2 different voices. The family swore both voices were coming from her at the same time. It made my skin crawl. My lieutenant listened to the tape later, and he looked at me and said, "Do you ever wonder?" And before he could finish, I said, "Yes. Yes, I do." Welfare Check by Chuck P. I answered a welfare check one late night, between 2:30 and 3. It was on an elderly woman who lived next door to the caller and hadn't been seen for some time. That night we were having a bad thunderstorm without the rain. I got to the complainant's house to speak to her first, wondering why she called at this time. and she told me the lady next door is in her 90s, lived alone, and she hadn't seen her in weeks. She had explained that she had called, went over and knocked on her door, but the lady wouldn't answer. I started thinking she was probably deceased and had been for some time. The car had a 3-inch layer of dust on it, and the mail was piling up, and there weren't any lights on. So first I walked to the side door and knocked on the door with my flashlight, loud enough that an elderly person, even with some hearing loss, should have heard it. After a minute of no response, I turned around and walked to the backyard, looking at the windows, and found everything to be okay. The complainant was with me and saying that she didn't know of any relatives the lady had, and by now I was sure she was probably dead. I walked to the front of the house and noticed that her blinds were up on the front windows, and I could see a glow from inside. I wasn't tall enough to look into the windows, which were probably about 7 feet off the ground, so the complainant ran next door and grabbed a bucket for me to stand on. I got on the bucket, and bingo, I could see the living room. The glow was from the TV, which was on a blue screen and was bright enough that I didn't need my flashlight to see in. I looked first at the floor to make sure she hadn't fallen, and the couch, recliner, and everything was empty. The telephone home base was blinking red with the missed calls and voicemails, and from the living room was a hallway that was dark and I couldn't see down. So I used my flashlight, and I could only see an open door down that hallway, and still no signs of life. I turned around and told the complainant that everything looked okay and nothing was disturbed. When I turned back around, an elderly woman was looking back at me with her face right up to the glass. I couldn't breathe. It felt as if I had been hit in the chest by a bat, and I fell backward and off of the bucket and hit the ground hard. The complainant came over to me, and I pushed her off as she was trying to help me up, and I righted the bucket and got back up to look in. My heart was pounding, but I had to see. Instinct had my hand on my gun, and the other was up on the window. I looked back inside and saw a frail, elderly woman standing in the hallway wearing a long nightgown with her back to me. She turned her head to the side and looked at me out of the corner of her eye, and then slowly walked out of view, down the dark hallway, and that really unnerved me. I got down and looked at the complainant, who was standing there with a puzzled look on her face. All I could say was that I saw her. By now the wind had picked up and it began to rain, and I began to walk back to my car by the road and turned back to the complainant and said, "Don't come back here." I got into my cruiser and drove to the PD. I never found out about the lady who lived there. The complainant never did call back, and the house now has different tenants inside. Some things are better left alone. The Weirdos, submitted by My Blue Line. I just came across your channel and happened to listen to some scary police stories and thought, hey, it's time to tell mine. I've been going to night school, and part of my studies have also included a creative writing class, and I thought, 2 birds with 1 stone. So here goes. I'd been a West Virginia state trooper for 12 years when this happened, and I can honestly say I'd rather answer 10 domestic violence calls than ever go back to the property I'm going to tell you about again. I spent most of my career working out of a detachment where the roads had names only because someone had bothered to nail faded green signs to trees decades earlier. The hollows were deep, the mountains were steep, and people generally handled their own problems out there, unless they absolutely couldn't. So when dispatch told me a new homeowner wanted to report ongoing harassment from neighbors but added, he's refusing to leave the property until an officer gets there, I figured I was walking into some petty property dispute over fence lines or logging rights. But boy, was I wrong. The place sat outside Marlinton, on nearly 80 acres that had once belonged to an old cattle farm. The driveway wound through overgrown fields before opening to a weathered farmhouse with 2 collapsing barns and a rusting silo. The owner, a guy I'll call Eric, met me before I'd even come to a full stop. He looked exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Eric was 38. He owned a software company he'd sold for more money than he'd ever expected, and decided instead of buying a mansion somewhere, he'd restore this farm that he'd stumbled across online. Turns out it ran in his family. He'd grown up loving woodworking, masonry, electrical work, the kind of guy who watched tutorials for fun, He figured restoring the place himself would keep him busy for years. One thing that stood out to me as we walked to talk on his porch, he said, "I thought I found heaven out here. Now I don't know what the hell I bought." Inside, everything was half finished. Drywall was stacked against walls, fresh framing, electrical wire hanging neatly between the studs, and he wasn't kidding about doing the work himself. He was doing a good job. He picked up a coffee cup before he started talking to me and finally said, "There's another house about a mile through the woods." And I nodded. I've never actually seen the house. And then I said, "What do you mean?" He explained that he'd found an old logging road leading towards it while clearing the brush, and the road disappeared into thick timber, but through the trees he spotted smoke from a chimney. I asked him if he had met anyone who lived there, and he said, "Yeah, they showed up the second day I was here." The first had been the father. The guy walked straight out of the woods around sunrise while Eric was unloading lumber. He didn't wave at him, and he didn't introduce himself. Eric said he just stood about 50 yards away watching. Finally, Eric waved back, and the man slowly raised his hand, but Eric said it wasn't a greeting. It was just like he was copying his movements exactly, but just a little later in time. Then he said he turned around and just walked back into the trees, never saying a word. Eric assumed it was just some eccentric mountain neighbor, but the next morning, all four of them came. The father, the mother, and two grown sons. He said they stood shoulder to shoulder where the driveway met the county road, and all of them just perfectly still watching him. Eric figured they were curious about his construction, so he waved again, and the father copied him again. And then the mother did it, then the older son, and then the younger one. One after another, he said, like they were waiting to take their turn. And then they all walked away in single file. Eric said, "I laughed about it. I thought maybe they had some strange sense of humor, but he said it stopped being funny by the end of the week. Every morning, no matter what time he started working, they'd appear somewhere on his property, never close enough for trespassing, always just inside the tree line. Sometimes he said there were all four of them, and sometimes it was just one. If he climbed onto the roof, he said they'd stand where they could see the roof. And if he was out working behind the barn, they'd relocate without him seeing them move. He looked up from mixing concrete one day, and somehow they were standing somewhere else. But he said it wasn't like they were hiding or sneaking. They were just there. He did say the strangest part was that they never acknowledged one another. Even standing inches apart, none of them looked at one another or said anything. They just kept watching him. After 2 weeks, Eric decided, hey, I better introduce myself. So he grabbed a 6-pack of soda and walked towards them, but by the time he'd crossed half of the field, they all turned around simultaneously and walked into the woods without changing pace. He never caught up with them. He did tell me, man, they moved quietly, and I said, everybody can move quietly. Eric looked at me for a minute and said, you don't understand. He pointed towards the forest and said, when they walk, the leaves don't crunch. That sounded ridiculous until he actually showed me. Fresh oak leaves covered everything. Walking normally sounded like stepping on potato chips. Yet he watched those 4 disappear through those dozens of times without ever making enough noise to hear. I figured he was exaggerating all of this, until later. The next thing started with his tools. Nothing was ever stolen. His tools just moved around, he said. A hammer he left on the porch one day would be standing upright in the middle of the driveway. Extension cords would be neatly coiled into circles 20 feet from where he'd left them. Any buckets he left out would be lined into perfect rows the next morning. Boxes were stacked by height. And again, nothing was ever stolen or damaged. Kind of like organized, but not really. That's when he decided to install trail cameras. Every single memory card came back blank. They weren't corrupted, they were just empty. This was his field of work. The timestamps showed that the cameras had been recording hours of missing footage. So he tried some different brands, and it was the same thing. He'd get motion alerts, but there were no images and blank cards. He installed one in his barn, too, and that one came back blank, even inside his own house. But he finally caught something accidentally. His phone had been recording a time-lapse when he installed kitchen cabinets, and reviewing it later, everything sped by normally until exactly 3:14 in the afternoon. Then every frame for the next 7 minutes contained only one image. The father, standing outside the kitchen window, looking in. The phone never showed him walking there and never showed him leaving. Just 7 straight minutes of the exact same frame, and then the normal footage resumed. Eric even showed me the video. He'd cracked out a laptop, and I looked at it, and it was unsettling. I can't say anything supernatural. I'm not sure I believe in that sort of thing, but everything was just weird. The compression made the man's face blurry, but his eyes stayed sharp, just watching what was going on inside the house. I asked Eric if he'd ever spoken to the sheriff before calling the state police, and he said, yeah, I tried. The deputy drove by while they weren't there, and he said it sounded just like neighbors being nosy. But then he gave me that deadpan look again and said, they know exactly when someone's coming. And I asked him what he meant, who. And he said, you. Anytime anyone comes out here, they're gone every time. He'd invited contractors to quote roofing work. When they showed up for an estimate, the family vanished the entire day. Other utility workers came out there, and the family was gone. Anytime he got mail, never saw them. But as soon as everyone left, they returned. It happened too consistently to dismiss. I decided I'd drive toward the neighboring property after finishing my report. Before I could, Eric asked if I'd like to see something. I said, sure, what else you got? He led me behind the barn. Fresh mud surrounded a small pond, and there were footprints, hundreds of footprints, bare feet, adult-sized, children-sized, some overlapping, some circling, all leading toward one spot where Eric had been rebuilding an old stone wall. None of the footprints led away. He pointed at them as if I didn't see them and said, they were here this morning. I examined them carefully, and the ground beyond should have shown exit tracks. But it looked impossible until I realized they probably walked backward in their own footprints. That had to explain it. And then Eric said something that bothered me. They always come barefoot. Even in 40-degree mornings, they're always barefoot. I finally headed toward the logging road, and about a half-mile in, I found the house, or what was left of it. It was leaning badly, and the windows were patched with plywood. There was a rusty truck sitting out sinking into the weeds in front. But 4 people were standing in the yard, a father, a mother, and 2 sons. I gave them my name and told them I was from the state police, and the father answered politely enough. He said, yeah, they knew Eric, and no, they weren't bothering him. They never entered his land. The mother smiled during the entire conversation and never said anything. And the sons, they didn't say anything, and honestly, it didn't look like they blinked either. Nothing they said gave me probable cause for anything. They seemed pleasant, just painfully awkward. Before leaving, I asked why they watched Eric every day, and the father answered with complete sincerity. We like seeing things become different. He didn't expand, and I didn't ask him anything else. He wasn't laughing, there was no grin on his face. That's all he said. I got back into my cruiser and drove away feeling foolish. Maybe Eric was reading too much into a family that simply lacked social skills. There's plenty of them in West Virginia. But that lasted just 3 days. Dispatch sent me back out, and it was just after midnight. The caller was screaming on the phone, and by the time I reached the property, every outside light blazed across the yard. Eric met me carrying a framing nailer like it was a rifle, and he couldn't stop shaking. I finally know why they watch. I said, all right, slow down, man, let's take it easy. And he just said, no, and pointed toward the barn. The sliding door stood open, and inside, under the lights, sat something that hadn't been there that afternoon, Eric said. It was an old dining table that had obviously been handmade. 4 mismatched chairs were sitting around it, and every tool Eric owned had been arranged across the tabletop with incredible precision. His tape measures nested by size, his chisels all lined up by width. Every screw and boxes had been sorted. In the center sat a fifth chair facing the other four, and on the tabletop was a single folded sheet of notebook paper. I put on my gloves and opened it, and in careful block handwriting it said, "Now you live here too." I looked at Eric, and he looked at me. "Looks like they finally came inside," I said, and he said, "Yeah, they did." He pointed toward the floor, and there wasn't a single muddy footprint. No forced door, the lock hadn't been broken, and nothing had been disturbed except this impossible arrangement. Then he said one detail that has stayed with me ever since this, and I'll wrap up this epic here. He told me that he checked my security cameras before I got there. I looked at him and he said, "They worked this time." So I asked to see the footage, and out came his laptop. The timestamp showed 11:42 p.m. The barn doors never opened. No one came into the barn. But without warning, the interior lights switched on, and the next frame wasn't a glitch. The table was simply there. The four chairs, the tools, everything, as if the barn had been photographed in two different realities 1 second apart. Then the lights from the camera shut off. We never saw anyone, there was no movement, there was nothing. I called it in and spent the next 4 hours searching the woods with deputies and a canine team. We found that neighboring family's house empty. The beds had been slept in and the food was still warm on the stove, but there were bare footprints leaving the porch. They wandered around the woods for nearly a mile before circling back to the house again and ending on the front steps. The family returned just after sunrise carrying buckets of blackberries. They acted genuinely confused about why we were there. There was no stolen property, no evidence, and no admissions. We had nothing we could charge them with. Eric sold the farm 6 weeks later at a loss so large most people would have called it insane. He told me losing money was cheaper than losing whatever sense of normal he'd had left. About a year later, I drove down that road again while checking on storm damage. The farmhouse had fresh paint, new fencing, and a different truck in the driveway. Somebody else had bought it. As I rounded the curve to leave, I glanced towards a distant tree line, and there were 4 people standing there, watching the new owner replace boards on the porch. It was the same people, just waiting and watching somebody else, making the life on that mountain different. Thanks for reading this if you do. Love your work, love the channel. No Scent by Joel P. Over 20 years ago, I took an alarm call at the old PTA building across from the street from a courthouse in Austin, Texas. The alarm had already gone quiet when I showed up with a senior officer, and we found an unsecured door slightly open on the east side. So he posted me there while he finished the perimeter and other officers arrived. I was staring right at the door when the alarm activated again, and the door slammed shut in my face loudly. The senior officer ran back to my position and asked why I'd closed the door, and I told him I hadn't. We called for canine, and the dog arrived shortly, so I went in with the dog to clear the building. We found nothing, but the entire time the dog was acting very hinky, like someone was in the building, but he wasn't picking up a scent. We secured the building, and a key holder showed up. He said, "Well, you know the place is haunted, right?" There was a secretary who worked there for about 30 years, and after she died, she kept showing up for work. Papers flew off of desks, doors opened and closed, people had sightings, the works. We both told the key holder the next alarm call there was all his. Rural Encounter. I work on county roads, and I had a signal 100 at 3 a.m. My closest bathroom was 30 minutes out, so I pulled down a dark gravel road and started my business. I felt like someone was watching me. Looking toward the rear bumper of my unit, and approximately 20 feet beyond my rear bumper, I saw a shadowy figure standing there. So I stopped and zipped up, I wasn't finished, and yelled out to what I thought was a person. I got no reply from the figure, and I started to apologize to it, thinking that this was the landowner coming to see who was peeing on their driveway. But I got no response. I then went into attack mode and demanded them to show their hands and identify themselves, but no answer. I finally got smart and used my light to see who it was, and as the light passed over the area, the figure was gone. Now, keep in mind, this conversation was about 20 seconds long, and I had just seen something there. I looked around and didn't hear any running through the brush, so I turned to get back into my unit, and I took one more look back and saw that shadowy figure moving towards me from where I last saw it. Needless to say, I got in my unit and sped off, because bullets were not going to stop that spirit. Entry Tools by Rob M. I responded to a suicide as the co-lead detective once. A male had hung himself in the tree in the backyard of the place, so we checked the residence, and it was locked with a deadbolt thrown on both entry-egress doors. I called for entry tools and a supervisor for a breach because the decedent's girlfriend was not accounted for, and we knew they lived together, thinking maybe possible murder-suicide. Several patrol officers and I were standing at the back door of the house on the south side, which had been checked multiple times, waiting on entry tools. I looked at the door, and there was a gap in the frame, and I saw that there had been no deadbolt thrown. Any more, that is. It certainly was on the first time I checked. Now I pushed on the door, and it was open. We cleared the residence, and no one was inside. I even had them clear the attic space. Inside the door that magically opened were multiple notes to family members from the decedent. We all walked outside and were waiting on Knock to arrive and try to walk back in. The door was secured again with a deadbolt. It should be noted that no one had keys and there were key locks on both sides of the door. The lead and I were now discussing how we were going to have to call for entry tools, but the door was open once again. No one was going near it. I again had the residence cleared, and no one was inside. The lead detective and I did not go back into that house that day. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you heard and saw, why not give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, leave a comment. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. It's all free and it all helps out with the algorithms, so I appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, and consider getting some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything: a ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.